Hello, once again, this is Pastor Phil Fernandes of Trinity Bible Fellowship, and uh, we covered an overview of the Bible as literature, showing that the Old Testament 39 books, the first 17 are historical books, taking you from the history of ancient mankind through the history, the start and the history of the Jews up to that point, and then the 5 poetic books, the books of wisdom, and then the 12 prophetic books of the Old Testament, then the 400-year gap in between the Old and New Testaments, and then you have the Gospels and Acts, the 5 historical books of the New Testament, and then you have the 21 epistles, letters of the apostles and their colleagues to the early church, and then the one prophetic book, the book of Revelation. Now I want to talk about historical overview, so Bible history. And so this is the history that runs throughout the scriptures. And you have to take each book, not just the historical books, to find out where they fit in Bible history, but even the other books. You need to see, well, where does this fit? It's just difficult sometimes to try to figure out where does certain psalms go. Now, if it's a Psalm of David, it goes during David's life. But some of the other psalms may have been written earlier, attributed to Moses, or later, attributed to Solomon or somebody after that. So if we could put each of the books in the historical context, it will really help us to our understanding. And so what I've done is I've broken down, and this is nothing new. I think my old Bible professor at Liberty University has something similar to this, if not identical with it, Dr. H.L. Wilmington at Liberty University. But the historical overview of the Bible in the first period is the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and it's called the Creation Period. And the Creation Period is the ancient history of the human race. The ancient history of the human race. And you have 4 key events here that fall into Genesis 1 through 11. You have creation, that God created a perfect world, a perfect universe, and created Adam and Eve in his image so that we were perfect. The human race was perfect, but then we fell into sin, and now we inherit a sin nature from Adam and Eve, and so there's a need for a Savior. So there's the creation and then the fall, okay? But God promised right after the fall that he would send a man born of woman, Genesis 3:15, a man born of woman who would crush the head of the serpent, would defeat Satan, and but would be bruised in the process. So that prediction of a suffering Savior went out to all mankind. Since Adam and Eve, all mankind would come from them. So creation and the fall, then mankind became so wicked, God flooded the entire earth and only saved Noah and his family, and 2 of each animal, 7 of each clean animals. And but instead of multiplying and filling the earth, mankind gathered together in a one-world government and a false religion, and tried to build the Tower of Babel. So you have the creation, the fall, the flood, and the tower, and then God divided man's language. God's not a racist, but God wanted mankind. He didn't want a consolidation of power and a consolidation of our wisdom, because he knew that technology, advanced technology, would just lead to a destruction of the human race and the planet Earth. And so God actually, in his judgments, there is mercy. And so you have the creation, the fall, the flood, and the tower. Now mankind is broken down into different nations. But each nation, instead of worshiping God, was worshiping a false god or false gods. And so God had to enter into the battle of the gods and choose his own nation. And so this is the Patriarch Period, the period of the Jewish fathers. So whereas the Creation Period was the ancient history of the human race, now the Patriarch Period is the start of the Jewish nation. And this is Genesis chapters 12 through 50, where God chooses Abraham. 4 key guys here: Abraham, the son of the promise, Isaac, then Jacob. Esau didn't get the blessing, Jacob did. And then Jacob had 12 sons, Joseph and his 11 brothers. They're the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Book of Job was probably also written around the time of Abraham. But God selected Abraham, elderly Abraham, and his elderly barren wife Sarah, and miraculously raised a son, the promised child, Isaac, would be God's chosen nation. And so God's going to enter into the battle of the gods by saying that the God of Israel is the one true God who created the heavens and the earth. And God would bless Israel if they served him. He would curse Israel if they disobeyed him. And so God selected Abraham. He promised to give him the promised land, the land of Canaan, the promised land. They would be his chosen nation, and through his seed, who is the Messiah, according to the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, through Abraham's seed, all nations on earth would be blessed. And then from Abraham came Isaac, and then Jacob and his 12 sons, Joseph and the 11 brothers. And Joseph gets sold by his brothers into slavery, and but rises to power, second only to Pharaoh. He's kind of a type of Christ. He sits at Pharaoh's right hand and rules over Egypt, and gets them through the 7 years of prosperity by taxing them, and then at the 7 years of famine does the food distribution. Well, that ends up bringing Joseph's brothers back. They thought he was long dead. They sold him into slavery, and now Joseph's brothers come back, and eventually he's reunited with his dad. They're given the land of Goshen because they're shepherds, and the Egyptians were like clean freaks. They didn't want to be around shepherds, but they understood that God saved Egypt through Israel, through Joseph, and so they gave them the land of Goshen where they multiplied. And then eventually you reached a point in time where a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph and didn't know the debt that the Egyptians owed to the Jews, and he saw them as a threat. They were multiplying quicker, so he enslaved them and all. And this takes us to the Exodus period. So the creation period, ancient history of the human race, creation, fall, flood, and tower. The Patriarch period, start of the Jewish nation, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and his 11 brothers. And then the Exodus period, where Moses delivers Israel out of Egyptian bondage. This covers the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, where the Jews, the 10 plagues, God delivers the Jews from Egyptian bondage through the 10 plagues, the last plague being the Passover, where the firstborn child of the Egyptian households was slain by this angel from the Lord, sent from God, and the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and being released from the bondage in Egypt. But the Jews, due to lack in faith, wandered through the wilderness for 40 years, and that they were counted in Numbers. Exodus, they're exiting out of Egypt. Leviticus, those are the rules and regulations for the Levitical order, the Levitical priest. Numbers, the Jews get counted. They wander in the wilderness because they didn't enter the promised land due to lack of faith, because there were giants in the promised land. And so then they die out, that generation dies out. Then they're recounted, another census is taken, so it's called the Book of Numbers. And then Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law to the Jewish people, to that second generation. And then Moses dies, and then everybody else from that generation dies except for Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who came back with a good report 40 years earlier. And then you enter into the conquest period, where Joshua enters the promised land and conquers the promised land. So the conquest period, Joshua and taking the promised land. And so then they conquer the promised land. They go into Jericho. God gives them the victory. They have a divide and conquer strategy. But Joshua told the Jews, make sure you choose which side. Are you going to worship the false gods of our forefathers, or the false gods of the Egyptians, or of the Sinai area, or are you going to worship the true God, Yahweh, the God of Israel? But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, Joshua says. Well, in the Judges period, there was a time of moral anarchy. There was no king in Israel. The tribes were not united. You had 13 different judges at different times. Some of their reigns overlapped. Some of them ruled all 12 tribes. Some of them didn't. You have Jephthah and his foolish vow, which gets his daughter killed. Gideon, who conquers the Midianites with only 300 Jews. Samson, who took a Nazirite vow from birth, didn't cut his hair, and but then eventually falls in love with Delilah. His hair gets cut, loses his strength. But he had killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He had tore a lion to shreds with his bare hands. But then God restored his strength when he was brought out to be mocked in the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, and he brings the temple down and kills the Philistines. So he killed more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. So those are the first 5 stages of Bible history: the creation period, the ancient history of the human race; the Patriarch period, the start of the Jewish nation; the Exodus period, Moses delivers Israel out of Egypt; And then the conquest period, that's the book of Joshua, Joshua and taking the promised land. And the judges period, the book of Judges, a time of moral anarchy. Of course, Ruth during that period remained true to the God of Israel, even though she was a Moabite lady. So those are the first 5 stages in Bible history. We'll pick it up there in the next lecture. God bless you. Please subscribe to the Phil Fernandes Show.